Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our first paper session of this conference. My name is Elissa Miller-Kay. I'm a lecturer here at PGVIM, and I'll be moderating the session today. And I'll also be presenting my own paper. So I'm very excited to be here and very excited to hear the various takes from the different presenters on the theme of this year's symposium. I think it should be quite an interesting afternoon. So each presentation will be about 20 to 25 minutes, and then there'll be some time afterwards for some questions and answers. So please do think if you have any ideas you want to share at the end of each presentation. So I will get us started with my paper. So I'm going to be talking to you today about Beethoven. And Beethoven is a really great topic when it comes to discussing myth, I find. So I'd actually like to start with the story of an expression, not a musical expression, but I'm going to talk first about a facial expression. The image you see here is a very famous bust of Beethoven made by the sculptor Hugo Hagen in the late 19th century. And Beethoven, if you look at his face, appears to be scowling. His mouth is downturned. This is actually a very iconic image of Beethoven. In fact, it's so famous that we can actually see it here sort of joked about in a comic strip. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the Peanuts comic strip, but Schroeder is the ultimate Beethoven fan. And right here in this comic, he's showing off his Christmas presents to Charlie Brown. And when he shows off the new bust of Beethoven that he received for Christmas, Charlie Brown replies, "Ooh, that's nice, it's very scowly." Okay, so this is the iconic image of Beethoven. So why is Beethoven scowling? Is this just how we imagine that he looked? Do we think he just went around scowling a lot? The answer is both yes and no. The facial expression that we see in this bust actually comes from a plaster cast of Beethoven made in 1812 by the sculptor Franz Klein. So I have it shown here. Beethoven's friend and colleague, the piano maker Johann Streicher, actually commissioned Klein to make a bust of Beethoven for his private concert hall. And Klein wanted the bust to be as realistic as possible. And so he insisted on making a plaster cast of Beethoven's face to work from. This is the mask that resulted. Beethoven's facial expression is quite striking. It seems to communicate a strong will, a tempestuous spirit, and deep suffering. In other words, it fits with the popular image of Beethoven, the great artist enduring a life that is difficult for the sake of his art. If you all know one thing about Beethoven, it's probably this, that Beethoven lost his hearing. And what could be more terrible a fate for a composer? Many people remarked on this, of course, during Beethoven's life. The musician Louis Spohr visited Beethoven in 1812, the same year that this cast was made. And after observing Beethoven play a piano that was obviously out of tune, and Beethoven couldn't hear that the piano was out of tune, he felt very moved with deep sorrow at this great artist playing this piano and couldn't even hear that it's out of tune. 1812 is also the year that Beethoven was suffering from probably the most acute heartbreak of his life. This is the year that he penned the now famous letter to his immortal beloved. He wrote, "My life in Vienna is a wretched life. Your love makes me at once the happiest and unhappiest of men." So are these the particular reasons for the scowl? Well, it actually turns out probably not, because there's actually a much more mundane reason. Having plaster applied to your face and then having to sit perfectly still as it dries is really uncomfortable. Franz Klein, the sculptor, was in fact called by some of his subjects head chopper, Kopfabschneider, because the procedure was so uncomfortable and everybody hated it. So in order to have this mask made, Beethoven had to sit with his head back perfectly still with quills up his nose so that he could breathe. And as the plaster was drying, Beethoven began to feel that he was going to suffocate. And so he moved abruptly And it's reported that he threw the mask on the floor in frustration, causing it to break to pieces. That's why you can see some fractures in it. So this puts the expression on Beethoven's face in a somewhat new light. It's not so much an expression of existential pain, but one of physical discomfort. However, this image really captured the public imagination. It was reproduced again and again. We see it here on the famous Beethoven monument, and it's in countless other paintings and sculptures, just showing a few examples. So I find that the life mask and the story behind it illustrate really well the relationship between Beethoven the man and Beethoven the myth. The existential pain we imagine that the mask captures is based on certain biographical details about Beethoven, that he was losing his hearing, that he was lonely and heartbroken. And these facts are true, but they don't represent the whole truth of who he was, or everything about his life. In other words, what the mask and the associated art represents is not so much Beethoven the man as Beethoven the myth. The facts of Beethoven's biography wouldn't really be of interest to any of us if it weren't, of course, for the awesome power of his music. So the primary reason we see Beethoven as a romantic hero is his music, or more precisely, a very small subset of his works, those in the so-called heroic style. So since about 1850 or so, these are the works that have been the perennial favorites of Beethoven. They would be on any greatest hits album. The Third, Fifth, and Seventh Symphonies, several overtures, and the Waldstein and Appassionata sonatas. Like many Beethoven enthusiasts, these are the works that first interested me in Beethoven's music. I recall receiving a cassette player. This shows how old I am. Cassette player and cassette tapes of all of the symphonies when I was 13. And I listened to them all, but I naturally gravitated towards Symphonies 5 and 7. I found them really exhilarating to listen to. I'm certainly not the only one that's had this reaction. This is a quote from a memoir of Berlioz, and he relates a story in which he coaxed a teacher of his, Elissa from the Paris Conservatory, to attend a concert of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. After the concert, Elissa was so overwhelmed, he said, it was incredible and wonderful. It stirred and affected and disturbed me to such a degree that when I came out of the box and tried to put my hat on, I couldn't find my head. There's also an account of a famous opera singer, Maria Malibran, being thrown into convulsions by the experience of hearing the Fifth Symphony for the first time. So what makes the Fifth Symphony and other heroic works so powerful? Most listeners, myself included, experience this music as a narrative, as a dramatic tale of conflict and triumph. This is quite a remarkable thing if you think about it, because there are no characters, there's no setting and no plot, and yet somehow this music feels like a story. Since there's no actual program or characters, the stories become all the more intense and personal. This is a quote from Victor Hugo that I really like, and he says, with Beethoven, the dreamer will recognize his dream, the sailor his storm, and the wolf his forest. So how does Beethoven manage to encode these kinds of narrative elements musically? In order to illustrate this, I'm going to use the example of the first movement of the Appassionata Sonata. So this movement, like virtually all of Beethoven's heroic works, contains musical elements that are related to basic plot elements of a classical quest story. The elements that I've got listed up here, they're adapted from Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, but some version of these elements are familiar to all of us from folk tales and books and movies that we see. So we have first the beginning of a journey, or a conflict and problem is introduced. Then we have some struggle or several struggles on the way. Then there's always some moment of climax or a crisis where we don't know exactly what's going to happen. and then there's some form of resolution. So I'm going to show you some of these elements in the first movement of the Appassionata. I don't have time to do the whole sonata, so I'll just do a few highlights. Okay, so I'll just show the opening theme. So, all right, the opening theme first. It's quite a striking theme. We hear it in octaves, parallel octaves between the two hands. And then immediately Beethoven sets up a harmonic conflict because he gives us the same music, but now in an unexpected key of the Neapolitan in G flat major. So this harmonic conflict is going to play out through the movement, often in terms of the dominant notes of those two respective keys, so D flat and C. And we hear this motive a lot in the piece, right? D flat going to C. This is a motive that I think we can all recognize the rhythm of from the Fifth Symphony. Schindler called this the fate motive. This probably reflects his own thinking and not Beethoven's. But what's significant for my purposes today is that many people, like Schindler, have heard in this motive, in this movement, the idea of Beethoven struggling against a fate that he doesn't want to accept. So there's this element, again, of struggle and opposition. A very common feature of the heroic works is the way in which the music moves forward, just continues pushing forward all the way through. So here we have, just as one short example, the transition theme to the second subject, second theme area. And so on. So you can feel this undercurrent of repeated notes that just keeps the music moving forward. A major conflict or struggle between D flat and C comes towards the end of the development section. I think it's definitely music that really epitomizes struggle. And I would call that, in the end of the development, a climax, but not the climax. Again, as is typical of so much of Beethoven's heroic works, the ultimate climax, or the most intense moment, is saved for the end. I'll play just a slightly longer passage leading up to this climax of the movement, because I want to highlight how Beethoven really builds tension leading to the final cadence, so that it's not just about harmonic closure anymore. It's not just about coming back to the tonic note. It's much more about a dramatic overcoming. It really feels like a kind of triumph when we get the final cadence. Okay, so this is music that has a lot of emotional power. And this actually caused some problems, really, within the area of Beethoven scholarship. It turns out this music was so compelling that it really shaped the way many theorists and music scholars thought about not just Beethoven, but all of music theory and all of music history. I'm just going to give a specific example of this from Beethoven's biography. So here again, we have another one of these famous images where Beethoven appears to be scowling. So this particular image comes with a story. The story is recounted by Bettina Brentano, or rather by Beethoven in a letter to Bettina Brentano. She was a friend of both Beethoven and Goethe and helped to arrange a meeting between these two great artists in the town of Teplitz. So as the story goes, Beethoven and Goethe were out walking together through the town when the Austrian imperial family happened to come passing by. Goethe, of course, immediately stepped aside and bowed like everybody. But Beethoven, he walked on, forcing the members of the ruling family to step aside for him. So Beethoven explained himself in the letter to Brentano by saying that he was noble by virtue of his talent, and that unlike Goethe, he refused to cling to old ideas about the superiority of the aristocracy. The Teplitz incident, as it has become to be known, really exemplifies the Beethoven myth quite perfectly. Beethoven here is pictured as this strong-willed, defiant, and independent artist. It's a really good story, but it's almost certainly fiction. The letter from Beethoven that describes this incident is written in Brentano's hand, not in Beethoven's hand. And she published this letter along with two others, ostensibly from Beethoven in 1839. So it's possible that she copied the letter out, but it's actually more likely that she wrote it herself. Miss Brentano doesn't have the best track record when it comes to this kind of thing. She also published some letters between herself and Goethe, and we know for a fact that before publishing them, she not only changed her own letters, but also changed Goethe's as well. So nonetheless, this incident was recorded in Thayer's famous biography of Beethoven, and still, even through the 20th century, as late as 1995, there's some biographies that mention this incident and say that Bettina's account has, should be taken seriously. But I think it makes a lot of sense to think she was probably influenced by general feelings about Beethoven's character and embellished them with this story. So I'll also talk briefly just about Beethoven's piano playing, which is a subject that, of course, as a pianist, interests me very much. So there are several eyewitness accounts of Beethoven's playing. However, we need to evaluate these very critically. Many accounts were written down years after the person actually heard Beethoven play, and the authors could easily be influenced by generally held perceptions of Beethoven, in other words, by the Beethoven myth. So here we have 4 accounts of Beethoven at the piano. The first is from Franz Gugel. He heard Beethoven play in 1812. He was quite a young boy at the time, and he told Thayer, Beethoven's biography, about it many years later. He said that when Beethoven played, half of the pianoforte strings were broken. In 1824, Edward Schultz described a visit with Beethoven the previous year and said, quote, "When he played on the pianoforte, it is generally at the expense of some 20 or 30 strings. He strikes the keys with so much force." Beethoven's friend and one-time pupil, Carl Czerny, however, gives a somewhat different account. He says that Beethoven's playing was, quote, "masterfully quiet, noble, and beautiful, without the slightest grimace, only bent forward low as his deafness grew upon him." And the Countess Giulietta Guicciardi, another of Beethoven's students, noted that Beethoven made a point of playing without effort. So the first 2 accounts create a somewhat different impression from the last 2. And it turns out that these first 2 accounts are a little bit suspect. First, we can take Glugel, who remembered these accounts many, many years later and heard Beethoven play when he was quite young. So we have to wonder just a little bit about that. The second one, Edward Schultz, is suspect even more so because when he visited Beethoven in 1823, that's at a time when Beethoven rarely played for anybody. Beethoven, really did not resisted playing the piano in these years for anyone, and Schultz was not a close friend. He would have just been an acquaintance. There's also no mention in Schultz's account of Beethoven being reluctant to play or not wanting to play the piano. Also, if you read the letter in its entirety, it really does read like somebody trying to impress the reader. So it seems far more likely that he's just embellishing his letter with an account of Beethoven's playing after having met Beethoven in person. What's interesting is that these two accounts that are somewhat suspect are also the ones that really play on the Beethoven myth. So they're taking the idea that Beethoven was a rough and powerful person, and therefore saying that his playing was rough and even violent. And it's a good example of how the myth can easily lead to inaccuracies in historical biography, historical information. People, all of us, we're generally not as consistent as any stories or myths that are going to be told about us or around us. It's certainly true for Beethoven. So is the myth all a bad thing? I would say no, actually. It's much too interesting and also inspiring to be entirely bad. I quite like this quote from the scholar Karl Dahlhaus. He says that the Beethoven myth is separated from empirical biography by a chasm that represents something more than simple opposition of truth and falsehood. To me, the Beethoven myth speaks to some of the most compelling values of Romanticism, ideals such as bravery, self-determination, and perseverance in the face of hardship. These are values that many of us aspire to today. So my take is that the myth and empirical biography serve different purposes and belong in different worlds. The empirical biography should be the focus of music scholarship, but the myth has a place too in the world of art. So this was really my inspiration for a recital I gave last year here at PGVIM. And it really grew out of my interest in the Appassionata, the sonata I just played a little bit of today, and in why this music is so interesting and compelling. So I decided to use this narrative idea as inspiration for the recital. So my first step was to try to pick some works that could be experienced together as a narrative or as a story. So one obvious way to do this with Beethoven is to select some representative works from the early, middle, and late phases of Beethoven's life and career. So I did this, but I also wanted a continuity between the works. I wanted that to have a kind of musical basis. So to this end, I selected sonatas that were closely related in key and that had a contrasting character that could establish a kind of narrative arc. So I decided on 3 sonatas, F major, opus 10, number 2, the sonata in F minor, the Appassionata, and A flat major, opus 110. So in terms of key area, we're moving from major to parallel minor and then to the relative major. So here's how the program sort of played out. Opus 10, number 2 is quite a light-hearted sonata. It's filled with good humor and excitement. So prior to playing, I spoke a little bit to the audience about Beethoven as a young man and how he was a young concert pianist and a rising star. For the second sonata, the Appassionata, this is obviously music of intense struggle. It's one of Beethoven's darkest works. So I preface this sonata with a brief discussion of Beethoven, how he lost his hearing, and a little bit about the Heiligenstadt Testament, a document in which Beethoven contemplates suicide, but decides to go on living for the sake of his art. The third sonata, opus 110, is an intensely spiritual work, and to me, the sorrow expressed in this sonata is on another level from that in the Appassionata. It's far more personal. So this is more the crisis of the story would occur in this sonata. Again, towards the end of the recital, just as in the Appassionata, it occurs towards the end of the movement. This is music, I think, that really transcends worldly concerns and takes us into the pits of despair and then through a glorious return to life. I found that this narrative frame was pretty useful, especially for audiences who were unfamiliar with Beethoven's music or classical music in general. I played this recital here, and I also played it a few times in tour in the United States and Canada. And many non-musicians told me that the biographical information really helped them appreciate and understand the music more. So here I just have a couple recitals from the performance. I decided to put the piano on the floor instead of up on the stage so that I'm on the same level as the audience. This seemed a little more conducive to storytelling, a little more intimate. I also provided some score desks at the back for anybody who wanted to follow along in the score. And both of these ideas were based on 19th century practices that were then quite common and are less common today. So based on this research, I think a natural next step and something I'd be very excited to do is just to consider other sides of Beethoven, so the non-heroic Beethoven. Beethoven more as a poet and more of the lyrical music. So works like the sonatas opus 78 and 90, the bagatelles, or An die Ferne geliebt, the song cycle. Okay, so I just end with a famous quote from Picasso that I think neatly sums up my feelings about the Beethoven myth. The myth itself is by no means a factually accurate account of Beethoven's life, but it's based on certain biographical details that are inspiring. And I think, through the music, we can certainly continue to feel inspired and turn to the myth as a source of inspiration or creative organization. Okay, so that's everything. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions or have any comments if anyone has them. Thanks.